Hello and welcome to this online interview organised by Improve, a new blog launched in Luxembourg which focuses on socio-economic issues. I'm Isabel Scott, I'm a journalist based in Luxembourg, and today I'll be talking to Branko Milanovic about his latest book, Capitalism, Alone. So let me briefly introduce our guest. Branko Milanovic was lead economist at the research department at the World Bank. He's affiliated with City University in New York, as well as the Luxembourg Income Study in Belval, and he's known throughout the world for his research on global inequality. And in his latest book, Capitalism Alone, which was published in 2019, he argues that today capitalism is the only global economic system. It has brought about wide-scale economic prosperity, but over the last 30 years has struggled to tackle rising inequalities. So in this interview, I'll be asking Branko about some key features of contemporary capitalism and what can be done to tackle these rising inequalities. So welcome, Branko Milanovic.
Well, thank you very much, Isabel. It's actually a pleasure to be here, if not really in person, at least virtually. So very nice to be speaking with you.
Perfect. So I'd like to start with looking at some of the key concepts that you introduce in your book. So in Capitalism Alone, you take a global perspective on inequalities, and you start by analyzing different archetypes of capitalism. For instance, there's classical capitalism, so think England in the 19th century, political capitalism as in China, social democratic capitalism, where we have welfare states developing post-World War II, and liberal meritocratic capitalism exemplified by the United States today. And it's this form of capitalism that I'd like to look at more closely, so the liberal meritocratic model. And so while not as unequal as classical capitalism, it does seem that liberal meritocratic capitalism still does a pretty good job at driving up inequalities. So those with the means can send their kids to expensive elite schools, who then marry the sons and daughters of other rich families. The assets of the rich earn the highest returns, making them even richer. And this sort of contrasts with social democratic capitalism, where trade unions, mass public education, taxes and social transfers have historically kept inequality in check. So my question to you, Branko, was how did this transition from a socio-democratic model to a liberal meritocratic capitalism come about? Is this just a natural evolution of capitalism?
It's a good question. Let me just try to answer how did the evolution happen. This is not something particularly original. I don't discuss it very much. Maybe I mention it in a few sentences only. We certainly had a change in the 1980s in the Western countries with Margaret Thatcher, of course, Ronald Reagan exemplifying that change. But of course, the change happened elsewhere. It happened in Spain with González. It happened in France with Mitterrand, as people might remember, actually, that Mitterrand in 1980 attempted to make much more socialistic policies and then actually had to change course very dramatically. Now, it happened because of the general unsatisfaction with some performances of socio-democratic capitalism, especially in terms of government spending, slow growth rates, and it was believed that with the dose of increased competitiveness, competition, lower role of the state, the economies would accelerate, the growth rates would accelerate, which actually did not happen. It was also thought that the government spending as a share of GDP would decline, but even if you look at that, it actually did not decline in Western countries over the last 30 years. So some of these expectations were unfulfilled, but the system did change, I think, perceptibly. Now, we should not exaggerate the extent of change, because still there are differences between the US and continental Europe. I focused in my book, as you mentioned, on the United States as a prototype of liberal and meritocratic capitalism. So obviously not every country is the same. The US, however, because of its size and importance, ideological and economic and so on, is a very useful prototype of this liberal capitalism that you to some extent define, and I'm sure we'll say more about it.
Okay, so liberal meritocratic capitalism would then be an improvement upon classical capitalism, but how about if we compare, the liberal meritocratic model to social democratic capitalism?
I would avoid the terms like improvement because they are sort of, to some extent, normative, or actually largely normative. So let me explain a few differences between classical capitalism, social democratic capitalism, and liberal, very broadly. First, in the terms of types of income that people receive. If you go back to the 19th century capitalism, as, for example, described in Ricardo and Marx and so on, you have, and Adam Smith as well, you have very clear distinction between the three factors of production, three social classes, and three types of income. These are landlords that gradually landlords became capitalists, and they are capitalists and they are workers. So essentially, then you have two, workers and capitalists. Now, what is interesting there is that entirety of income by each class is received from one source. Capitalists generally receive income from, almost always receive income only from capital or from ownership. Workers receive from selling their labor force, labor power. And moreover, you have a very clear ranking in the sense that historically landlords were the richest, then capitalists came number two, and then workers number three, and very little overlap. Now, compare that to the situation today, which is actually very interesting. Possibly for the first time in history, or at least in the last 2 centuries, we have a very significant share of people in the top who have lots of their income, I'm not saying 100%, but lots of their income coming from labor. So that was not the case in the past. So what you have now under liberal capitalism, you have rich people who are essentially workers in the classical sense, in the sense that they have to go to work and make income from the sale of their labor power. Now, obviously, they're extremely well paid. They're actually CEOs, they are financial management, they are asset management companies, heads of the asset management companies, they can be software developers, they can be doctors, but they're still technically workers. So this is actually a big change. And if you look at the number of such people in the US, for example, and in Western Europe, you find about 1/3 of the people who are in the top decile are also people who are also in the top decile by labor income and by capital income. And that was not the case in the past. So that's one difference between liberal and classical capitalism. I will come in a moment to actually whether that difference can be interpreted in a good way or in a bad way, because you can interpret it both ways. But it is nevertheless a very significant difference in the sense of reduced importance of what used to be the key marker or the key class discriminator between different people.
But shouldn't we still be aiming to, have this sort of return to a social democratic capitalism, as this would benefit, most people, or at least we wouldn't have, just exclusively the rich, as it were?
Yeah, Isabel, I see that you want me to push me towards discussion of the social democratic capitalism. So let's do that. Why do I actually use these two terms, liberal and meritocratic? They are not terms that I used just sort of because they sound nice. They come from John Rawls. Now, John Rawls, in defining the American, of course, philosopher, political philosopher, in defining equality, he actually has two types of equality that I then basically use to define the liberal and meritocratic capitalism. Meritocratic, in his terminology, is not what we sort of casually call it. Meritocratic is some kind of deserved income and so on. Meritocratic, in his terminology, simply means equality before the law. So there are no legal impediments, and there are no legally defined classes or castes or any other social group. So it simply means we all have the same legal rights. So it's actually very little in terms of redistribution, in terms of social democratic rights and so on. When he comes to liberal, he actually thinks that liberal corrects inequality in two ways. It corrects inequality by making public schools dominate and be better, or maybe be the sole type of schools rather than private, because free education, or actually non-paid education by individuals who go to school, is a requirement in his view of equalizing life chances between people who come from different families. So that's the first sort of requirement. The second requirement that he has is very high taxation of inheritance. And that's the same logic, because if you actually reduce ability of rich descendants to take lots of financial assets, then obviously you're also equalizing opportunities. So he has actually two big equalizers. One of them is education, the other one is inheritance. And what we have seen compared to the past, I think, and that's where we come to the social democratic versus liberal capitalism, we have seen that these two equalizers have really not performed more recently as well as they had in the past. You have really an increase of importance of the private education. As you know, in the United States, it's an extremely expensive education. For most of middle-class families, it's quite sort of inaccessible. And on the other hand, we have had also reduction of the marginal tax rates on top incomes. We have had abolition in some cases, and in some cases, significant reduction of taxation of inheritance. So this would be the distinction between social democratic and liberal capitalism.
So I'd like to move on to one of the key sort of concepts that you introduce in Capitalism Alone, which is this concept of homoplutia. What is homoplutia?
Yes, Isabel already alluded to that without using the word. First of all, it's a new word. I made it up. It's, of course, like every time that we have a new phenomenon, we create some Greek neologism. So this is a Greek neologism. Homo obviously means equal, the same, and plutia, wealth. So the idea was here, it actually came from the observation, as I mentioned before, that you have in the top income groups an increasing percentage of people who are rich, both in terms of what is called human capital. They are very highly educated, have high labor income. And then on the other hand, they also are fairly rich in terms of their capital income. So in other words, let me just give you a simple example. I don't know, because I don't have longitudinal data, how they have become rich both in human capital and in property. But imagine that somebody actually goes to very good school, has a very good job, has very high salary for, let's suppose, 10, 15 years, is able to save quite a lot of money, marry somebody who is very similar, invest that money, and then you find him at 45 years of age or something with very high salary and with very high property income. And we observe empirically the increased percentage of such people in top income groups. So they're both like rich capitalists and rich workers. And to give you a sort of an idea of the numbers, in the US, about 1/3 of the people in the top decile belong to the rich capitalists, which means they're in the top decile by capital income and in the top decile by labor income. Now, go back to countries like Mexico and Brazil that are much more classical capitalists. That percentage is 6%. And why is that the case? Because either you have people who have high labor income, but they don't have capital, or people with large capital or capital income, well, they are not really generally wage workers. So, in the classical capitalism, that percentage is small. But in this liberal capitalism, that percentage is quite high. And that's actually the definition of homoplutia that I have in the book.
In your book, you also describe homoplutia as being, you describe it as a dangerous phenomenon that has the potential to erode democratic processes. How come?
Homoplutia, so far as I was kind of describing homoplutia in relationship to classical capitalism, you could say, well, this is actually a very good development. You don't have that very sharp distinction, cleavage between capital owners and laborers. So here you have actually laborers who are both capital owners, and in some extent, the distinction between capital and labor, at least in their own personas, has been transcended. Okay, so you say, well, that's good. On the other hand, if you have the situation that I described, you do have a creation, possibly or creation of an elite. Now, that elite is very resistant and very invulnerable to shocks. Let me give you the reason. If you have a shock on the capital side, they have high labor income. If you have a shock on the labor side, let's suppose high unemployment suddenly among software developers, then they have a recourse and they can fall upon the high capital that they have. So in that sense, they're actually very resilient to change. Furthermore, with low taxation and special ability to transmit advantages across generations, they are actually able to transfer this advantage to their descendants. And then you really create a sort of to some extent, elite that inherits the advantages over time. On top of that, you mentioned that in passing, a greater prevalence of homogamy, now to use another Greek word, of marriage between people with similar incomes further exacerbates that. So the danger there, to summarize, is the creation of a new elite which would be able to transmit its advantages across generations.
So I hope my question is not obvious, but would homoplutia reduce social mobility?
Well, that's the idea, actually. And then I cannot say that we currently can link homoplutia to the reduction of social mobility, because the two types of studies developed independently. But we do actually observe a reduction in social mobility in a number of countries. And we find the reduction of social mobility to coincide in terms of time with the increase of inequality. Now, whether the three things go together, I really cannot tell yet. Actually, somebody would need to study that, and it's not easy because you really need the data across generations. But there are three things which clearly are somehow related: increased inequality, increased homoplutia that I just talked about, and reduced social mobility. And to then link it up to the question that you asked, if this is indeed true, and if indeed an elite is being created, moreover, an elite that, for example, in Daniel Markowitz's book about meritocracy, moreover, about an elite that believes that its own advantages are well-deserved, that elite would also gradually, and it already is now, controlling the political process. So you really then have a problem. You have a problem of a inherited elite that gradually takes over political power. And that was the point that, of course, you alluded before regarding to some extent, I would not say the danger of democracy, but a sort of too high influence on the democratic process coming from a relatively limited number of people.
So you do say that the fact that people who receive income from capital, also work for their money, and that would make it harder to hike up income tax rates, since today's wealthy are then seen as having earned their money, as I said, through work, and then the perception is no longer that they've simply inherited their money or live off investments. So my question would be, like, what role could income taxes play in tackling inequality?
I think it's a very good question. I think that we have to, I hate to kind of use this word like multidisciplinary, but we really have to look at this whole thing in a very multidisciplinary framework. I mentioned the book about meritocracy. The book about meritocracy by Daniel Markowitz, who is actually a legal scholar, really emphasizes that element of perceived self-deserved. In other words, the perception by that group, by the elite, that the advantages that they have are well-deserved because they are the advantages of good education, hard work, because very often, these people work very hard. As we know from statistics, actually, the people with higher income levels work more hours now than people with low income levels. That was the opposite in the past. I was recently reading Marx, and Marx mentions, or actually Adam Smith as well mentions that. He says people who work the hardest are the poorest. People who work the least are the richest. Now we don't have that situation. So that actually makes them feel deserving of the advantages that they have. And that, or to some extent, makes taxation of such high incomes or inheritance and so on sort of politically more difficult, I think. Because if you had like in the past, like guys who were just, clipping coupons to make money, you say, well, they're doing nothing really, basically, so why not tax them? But here you say, well, these people are working 70 hours a day, 70 hours a week. Some of them might like to work 70 per day, but it's hard. And then it's really, you have a resistance to that among themselves and among the rest of the population. So I think it makes it more difficult. And on the other hand, if you don't do that, you really start undermining these two original things that we mentioned, that John Rawls introduced in, I think, 1971 in his book. You really undermine ability of the state to control transmission of wealth across generations, and you undermine the ability of the state to provide about the same level of education to everybody, regardless of their financial starting point.
So if you're saying that, for those reasons, taxing would be politically not, unviable, do you regard that for all taxing? How about, taxing capital, dividends, etc.? Would that be a possibility?
No, I'm not saying it's unviable. I mean, we do still have taxes, and some taxes are high and so on. I'm just saying that ideologically, sort of increasing taxation on such high income becomes harder. And that's, I think, in that context also that we should interpret a general unpopularity of, for example, inheritance taxes. As you know, in a number of countries, they have been totally eliminated. In other countries, they actually kick in at a fairly high level of income, level of wealth that is being transmitted. So these taxes are not so popular. And I try in the book to argue that we should not think of every problem as being solvable by taxes. So let's slap one tax here, another slap another tax there. What we should, I think, try to do, I'm in favor of increasing some taxes, but we should also try, in my opinion, to broaden the ownership of capital. Because when you have capital still being owned by a relatively small percentage of people, despite the homoplotia that I talked about, when you look now from a different angle and look who actually has high capital incomes, you find that they are actually fairly concentrated. So if we have a concentrated capital income, and if the share of total income from capital in GDP increases, then that pushes inequality up almost by not almost, but it's pushing it by definition. So I think broadening capital ownership, which means making certain advantages for small investors, actually tax advantages, or introducing worker ownership in much more serious way than we have done. That, of course, as you know, the regulation in many countries exists for that. I think there are two among other means of what is called pre-redistribution. In other words, making the field more equal before you come to the tax and transfer policy.
Okay, thank you for that. I wanted to address one issue that some book reviews sort of state regarding your book, saying that you espouse the view that there's no alternative to capitalism. How do you respond to that claim? Could I just simply say, well, it is what it is, and this this current economic model is the best that we can ever hope for?
No, I actually even put in, if you might remember, there was a small section where I intentionally put Tina, from Margaret Thatcher. No, I don't. What I meant is the following. If you look at the current state of the world, what you notice two things at least regarding the extent of capitalist relations to production. First of all, they have spread all around the world. You didn't have until the fall of communism, where you had one significant part of the world that did not have capitalist relations to production. Now that has changed. Even China, and of course that's a separate topic that I call political capitalism and so on, is de facto actually by all measures about private ownership, about the number of people who are employed in the private sector. China is overwhelmingly capitalist. Now, it has a different role of the state, but we will not talk about that right now. And that's why it's called political capitalism in my book, or you can call it state capitalism if you wish, but it's nevertheless capitalism. Secondly, in many activities which were not commercialized in the past, we have really an increased commercialization. And these are the activities like Airbnb, like Uber, renting the apartments, using your free time, influencers, using your free time to basically make money and so on. So this is really what was a typical thing that people, socialists, were discussing before World War I, is the spread of capitalists' need to expand, because otherwise they make no profit. So you cannot have a capitalism with zero profit. And that was this expansion into new activities. So to conclude, there are two things which I see significantly different from the past. It is the geographical dominance of capitalism and the creation of new activities which are commercialized. The activities in the past, or such activities in the past, were not commercialized. And I mentioned, of course, family there, and the fact that actually you can, basically many people now live by themselves. The case of rich countries, you take Scandinavia, the average household size, we know that in Luxembourg income studies is barely above 1. So in those cases, of course, you don't have the typical role of family, which used to be non-commercialized. You have all these activities now being provided by the market. And that's, of course, a big change.
Okay, fair enough in terms of, these changes that happen. But so from my understanding, there's no sort of fundamental calling into question of the model. And I'm just wondering how sustainable that is, considering we're in a climate crisis, rising inequalities, and so on.
So, Elizabeth, let me answer this question first by being clear about what we mean by capitalism, because people call capitalism or socialism many things. I used in the book a very sort of economical, very succinct definition that was used by Marx, and it was used by Max Weber. And it has 3 components. It says capitalism is characterized first by most of production being conducted on privately owned means of production. Okay, number 1. Secondly, most of labor is hired labor, which means labor is not having the entrepreneurial role. Labor is hired. You go and you say, okay, I would like to work for you, and I'm being told what to do. And secondly, it's important also within that same definition that laborers are not self-employed. So these are actually part of a hierarchical formation where they are selling their labor power. And the third part of the definition is decentralization. The coordination is decentralized. So companies are not told what to produce. They produce whatever they want. People are not told where they should be working. They go and work wherever they want. So actually, basically, there is a legal freedom of individuals. So this is the definition. Now, when I apply this definition, as I said before, to China, it turns out that basically by that definition, China is capitalist. And people ask me, okay, so can we imagine now socialism? Well, then I say, okay, let's look at the 3-part definition. Are you in favor of state ownership of the means of production? Number 1, the part 1 of the definition. Nobody is in favor of that as a dominant form. Are you in favor of workers having an entrepreneurial role? That was a little bit different, because here you have actually an important, ideological movement that would actually like to see greater democracy at the workplace. So that, just keep this in mind. The third one, is anybody against decentralized coordination? Very few people. So really where I can see the change happening, so I'm not discarding it, but I see it at the level of greater democratization of the workplace, where workers do have greater role. And I give one example, which is actually, I think, an interesting example, with a number of startup companies, which are interesting in the sense that the employees or people who have the idea basically use capital, they borrow capital, but the owners of capital are not the deciders. They are not decision makers. They are simply lenders. And you see there the relationship changes. It's actually, to some extent, these people are workers, and they have the power to decide what to do. So, I do allow for change, but we have to be clear what we mean by transcending capitalism. It's a nice word, but I like to see it really defined.
Thank you, Branko. I would just like to return to, because there has been a question in the chat regarding the point that we talked about with taxation, where you suggest broadening ownership of capital. But could you develop the options on taxation? So what types of taxes would be viable, acceptable? Yeah, did you see what we're getting at?
No, I know, I see what you're getting at, but I have to say that in the book, if you look actually when it comes to recommendations, I was very, again, to use the same word, economical, for two reasons. First, I don't know conditions of individual countries and places, so have a blanket sort of statement is, I think, not particularly useful. And for a second reason, I have to say that I'm being somewhat allergic to a permanent use of taxation for any problem to be solved. There is a kind of a surplus, there is a redundancy of taxation proposals. I do believe taxes have to play a very important role, and they play an important role. But I think we should also try thinking about what I called before, pre-redistribution. In other words, equalization of, not total equalization, by broadening of asset ownership. And that broadening of asset ownership is, of course, broadening of financial ownership, but it's also broadening of human capital to some extent. So if you have, let me give you a very simple example, if you have essentially private education, which is inaccessible at the higher level, university and graduate level, then you really have, to some extent, a monopoly even over human capital. And so when I'm speaking of broadening, I'm really thinking of broadening both in terms of traditional ownership of physical assets or financial assets, but also in terms of accessibility to the high levels of education. So I really would like to shift the discussion more towards that, and not to, whenever we have an issue, just think of a new tax form to apply.
Okay, thank you for clearing that up for us. I'd like to move on to this one concept that you sort of introduce as, it's not the third way, but that you talk about this different form of capitalism that we could move towards. You call it people's capitalism. What are its main features?
People's capitalism really sort of follows from what I was just saying now, is theoretically, imagine the situation where you would have that everybody, I mean, I know this is kind of obviously not realistical imagination, I just want to put it in extreme form so that we understand what I mean, that everybody would have an equal share of capital and labor income. So in other words, this homoplutia that I talked in the beginning, which is now limited only to the rich people, that homoplutia would become widespread. So in that case, you're not solving the inequality issue, because the inequality can still exist, simply because you can have both, you can have more of both capital and labor than not. So you would be richer and there would be inequality. However, that inequality would be, how should I say, technically, and I think in practice, more limited because of the absence of that heavy concentration of capital incomes that we know now in rich countries, 30% of people have zero capital income. Others have very tiny capital income and their sole ownership is essentially housing. So it's only when you come to the top 5% that you have a really significant share of ownership from capital. So if you were to have this people's capitalism where the shares between labor and capital will be the same or more or less the same across population, you would thereby reduce sort of intrinsic inequality which comes with the greater importance of capital. So that's the idea. Just to be clear, the homo, as I said before, the homoplatia, which is now limited to the top, should be much broader, and that would imply that the ownership of capital, as I was saying before in the different contexts, would be widened. And this would be kind of a people's capitalism, which is, different from liberal in the way that liberal is different from classical.
Okay, so I get that, the idea is to sort of widen the share of the cake, as it were, but how, what changes, I mean, we're talking theoretically, but what changes would need to happen in order to move towards that form?
No, I mentioned, for example, for the broadening, and this is not original, people have been talking about that for a while, as you know. First, if you want really to broaden ownership of capital, many people of my age might remember that was the idea, actually, believe it or not, of Margaret Thatcher, that we should have broader ownership of capital. Nothing happened of that, but it just was there. So you could, of course, give a significant. Let's start with workers first in the companies. We currently have the situation that only the top guys, the managers and very rich CEOs or financial officers and so on, receive shares as payment. You could actually make shares also be received by workers. It is true that many of them might sell them, although you can actually also have legal rules there which would push them, I mean, not ban them from selling, but actually give a special incentive to people to keep them so that they actually remain vested in the company and in the shares that they have. And you could also give special tax advantages to small investors. So there are things that have been done, but in a fairly, I think, modest way. But they could be increased very substantial. There were proposals. I think Isabel Sowell in the U.S. proposed, for example, tax advantages for the companies if they actually do this much more broader shareholding among workers. So, there are ways of doing that. And as I said, this is not something totally new.
And in what way would that change, or would that be you sort of contrasted this people's capitalism to the liberal model, and could you also do that comparison to social democratic capitalism?
There is one, I think, big difference between this kind of theoretical people's capitalism and social democratic. Social democratic capitalism is essentially based on redistribution after the primary or the market incomes have been received. So it actually has a very significant role. I mean, the entire role practically is given to transfers and taxes. And this is linked, as you know, to the insurance principle, because that insurance principle kicks in the case of unemployment benefits, benefits which are linked to the aging, pensions, benefits to the link to other life events like having a child. In that case, of course, transfers kick in. So that's the philosophy of social democratic capitalism. The philosophy of people's capitalism would be not to change that part, but to actually make the pre-redistribution or equality of financial and physical capital and human capital be at the center stage. So in other words, let me put it like give you an example. If you look at two countries, Taiwan and Canada, they end up with about the same Gini coefficient at the end at disposable leveling. But Canada, which is, let's say, social democratic, transfers about 35% of GDP through that system of taxation and transfers in order to reduce inequality of market incomes, so disposable income inequality becomes less. Taiwan, which interestingly has very equal distribution of capital, of ownership, and doesn't have high wage inequality, transfers less than 10% of GDP to achieve the same objective. So what I want to say is that if you had more equality at the primary stage, you would actually need less of a redistribution at the secondary stage. Does this make sense?
Yeah, no, that does. Thank you. That really helps, situate. No, thank you very much for that. I would like to come back to the homo plutio concept, because, you say, you've described how there's this economic elite that increasingly controls politics or influences politics for its own benefit. So if the rich, dominate politics to that extent, how could, say, a wealth tax be implemented? Doesn't that make it then impossible to move towards a people's capitalism?
I think it makes it very difficult to move, because you would really have to ask people who are benefiting from the system and who are controlling the system that they should tax themselves and they should limit their own influence. I think it's quite difficult, and I think we have not paid sufficient attention to that. There is, of course, a general perception that populism is the threat. Now, not going into the discussion of what is populism, how to define populism, and so on. I think there's sort of a more plutocratic, de facto plutocratic capitalism, in my opinion, is a more present danger. And we sort of forget about that. And I think actually there is a nice work done, for example, on the control of the media by very rich people. I mean, taking, for example, now, of course, Elon Musk has bought Twitter, but before that, Jeff Bezos has bought the Washington Post. The Atlantic magazine is owned by the widow and money of Steve Jobs. So essentially, we have accepted that rich people can own the media. And by owning the media, you are, of course, creating the sort of intellectual milieu, the atmospherics, whereby you influence what is considered acceptable policy or not acceptable policy. So, and this is in addition to their direct influence, particularly in the US, through contributions to electoral campaign. So you have really two big influencers. And for example, there is this very interesting book, I mentioned it in my own book, in Capitalism Alone, about dark money. So you basically have influence of the rich over the contributions to the university system, which actually I'm a beneficiary, because the Stone Center was founded by a rich person, But the question is raised, do rich people is the educational system going to really depend on the rich people? So that's one. Secondly, the control of the media. Thirdly, the electoral contributions. So if you put all of this together, you de facto create an atmosphere where an alternative policy is very difficult. You can envisage that theoretically, but how to push through with that is very, very difficult. And that's why I think it is really quite kind of, how should I say, it does undermine the system of approximately equal political power across individuals. So I don't want to use the big word like democracy and stuff like that. I just want to say, ideally, we would like to have approximately equal political power for all individuals. And clearly we don't have it.
You gave these examples of, US media being brought up by these big, rich billionaires, etc. And just to sort of shift that focus, your book focuses a lot on the US, on China. I was wondering in what way does your analysis translate to Western Europe or even Luxembourg?
I do think that it does translate. Let me give you several examples. For example, the media ownership. There was, I think, a couple of books by Julia Caget, which deal with France. And the media ownership is also fairly, not only concentrated, but it's actually, the point here is not really concentration per se. The point is that the rich people own it. They may be not concentrated, and they may be different rich people. And these different rich people might have different political views, but that doesn't change the fact that they own. Similarly, I think when you come to educational system, I think, and we all know that even continental Europe has moved towards the American model. It is not there, but clearly private education, which is still relatively, by American standards, relatively accessible, becomes, how should I say, first, you have to pay for it, becomes less accessible, and gradually might become even less so. So there, I think, changes. I like the US, as I said before, not, I mean, as an example, not only because it's such an important country, but because certain of the phenomena are much clearer because they're simply more obvious. But I would not, in the book too, I actually don't think that Europe is a very different sort of animal politically and economically than the United States. And even if finally, if you look at actually changes which happened when you had COVID or when you had a global financial crisis, you see very strong similarities. And you see the similarities because the economies are very similar. And consequently, they react the same way. So I just don't see, I see Europe obviously is different, but I don't see it as a different model, entirely different model.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting that you sort of touch upon how the US being so, clear cut in its ways, it's such a good example. And whereas, looking at Western Europe, it is less obvious. And that's sort of my question that I'd like to ask, because are we, is social democracy, is that model still the dominant form in Western Europe, or are we, well, we're not exactly where the US are at? Are we a hybrid? What would you say?
From my point of view, and I'll explain in a minute where my point of view comes from, but from my point of view, this is the same model with two different, or maybe even three different versions, slight differences. Now, I know, and that's why I've criticized political scientists, and I got into a fight with them. Political scientists for last, half a century almost, have worked on varieties of capitalism. And varieties of capitalism for them made sense maybe until 1989 to focus only on Western Europe and the US and Australia and New Zealand. However, the world has changed since. And we have not only capitalism elsewhere, as we were saying before, but even if you disagree with me on China, we have capitalism in Indonesia, in Nigeria, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Ivory Coast, in a bunch of countries. And somehow they are not into these varieties of capitalism literature. Why is it important? Because if you have this worldwide view, then when you look at West and Europe, European Union, and the US, they do actually, from the world perspective or global perspective, they look very similar, because from that perspective, you see similarities much more than the differences. But if your objective is just to study, whether Luxembourg is different from Sweden and Sweden is different from Germany, of course, you're going to see difference in, policies towards unemployment, toward maternity leave, toward, I don't know, number of days of sick leave that you can take. But I believe, and that's why I was trying to explain, that my view is, I try to have a global view, that these differences are less important than the similarities between continental European model, then including, of course, the UK as well, and the United States.
Mm-hmm. You've given us your I'm not sure, ideal version of where we could be headed with people's capitalism, but let's say realistically, what is your suggestion, or your view of where we're headed moving forwards?
If you want to kind of summarize it in a sort of a strong form, you can say there are actually two different ways to go. One way to go is to, if I'm right, to continue with the increased importance in the political sphere through all these channels that I mentioned, and transmission of different advantages across generations, and to create de facto a new elite. That would be an elite which would be co-opting the new members, which would be hardworking elite, but it would be nevertheless an elite. And we would not be aware of that because it is a new elite. We would not be aware of that for another 1 or 2 generations, when we would notice that basically the same people always stay, the same families stay on top. So that's one possibility. And that's this plutocratic development that I think is basically a dangerous development. And the second development is to make the changes that we talked about, whether in taxation policies, but more importantly in these two things that Rolf has been talking about, transmission or inherited advantages, both in the educational space and in the financial space, that would make this sort of transition to an elite-based system very difficult. And I think that this is a basic choice. And if I can link it, for example, now for to my new book, which looks at inequality over the last 2 centuries, like it starts with Francois Quesnay and goes all the way to 1990s. What you notice is that the writers like Quesnay, Smith, Ricardo, Marx always talk of classes. And we started our discussion today with class structures. With Pareto, we talk about the elites. But we have sort of, if the class cleavage now is less important, as we were saying before in our conversation, the elite cleavage has not disappeared. And actually, this is a real sort of a culture, call it present danger, is the creation of the elite. So we should not sort of imagine that if we have solved, quote unquote, to some extent, the class problem, that we have solved and we have entered the world where everybody is equal, where the elites do not exist, and so forth. I think that our thinking, actually, both in economics and sociology, has really to go much more in the direction of elite creation and maintenance of power, economic and political, by the elites.
Well, thank you very much, Branko Milanovic, for your time. And I think in that sense, I think I've done my questions, so we're done for the round, but I know that there's probably more.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I really appreciate it. I'm actually very happy. I think we have covered practically everything, possibly with the exception of assortative mating, which I forgot also to mention is one way of which these advantages are further consolidated, and which also is positive and negative, because it's positive because it gives greater power, especially to women, to marry whom they want compared to the past. But on the other hand, it consolidates the elite. So I think we have covered all of that, which relates to liberal capital, well, all these names, liberal, social democratic, people's capitalism, all of that. So thank you very much for your questions. And I'm wants to say again, I'm really very happy that we had a chance to have this conversation.
Thank you very much.